Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, good morning. Okay, so this week we are going to talk about state capitalism, next week also. So, this table or figure is from an Economist magazine, and they had this special article, and it was titled State Capitalism. Okay, so this was when China had done, has grown very fast, and then the presence of so-called state-owned companies, right, became very visible. Okay. So that's why the Economist magazine had this special article, and then they showed this, graph, and say for China, right, this circle on the top, basically 80% of the firms, well, in this case, listed firms, are state-owned in some way, okay? And Russia is like 62, Brazil is 38, okay? So these are the percentages. And by looking at the size, right, but in this case, looking at the size by revenue, you can see that these yellow bars are the so-called state-owned or state-controlled companies. So you can see of the top 10, 4 of them are, state-owned. And 3 of them are, these are Chinese companies, right? The 4th one is a basically it used to be a post office, but then it was privatized. So this is so-called Japan Post Holdings. Okay, so these are, the state-owned companies, the yellow bars. And then if you look at by sector, by industry on the right-hand side, you can see energy, right? Energy companies are more than 65% owned by the state or run by the state. And this is from, the MSCI Emerging Market Index. MSCI is Morgan Stanley, I think it was Morgan Stanley Capital Index. And they have, sub-index, and this is for the emerging market. Okay, so they choose the companies that are so-called investable for institutional investors. So then they create this index. So that becomes a benchmark for fund managers. So that's why they have this so-called MSCI index, but they have different categories. But this one is just for the emerging market. Okay, so within this category, it's 65%, right? More than 65% of the firms in the energy sector is owned by the state. And then utilities, like water or gas, right? So that's over 50%. And then telecommunication, financials, industrials, materials, and so on. But you can see that many of these, energy, utilities, telecommunications are typically state-owned or used to be state-owned. Yeah, like in Australia, Telstra, right? Telstra used to be state-run, right? It's privatized, right? So, and there are, banks like Commonwealth Bank of Australia. I think that used to be a state bank. Okay, so so this is how it looks like. So therefore, the state-owned companies or state-controlled companies are not just large, but it's pretty one of the largest, but also like countries like China, many of them are state-controlled or state-owned. Okay, but you will find that it's not just in former socialist countries. You see many state-owned companies. In fact, there are, or there used to be, a lot of state-controlled or state-owned companies in so-called market economies. Okay. So this is going back again, right, to the table that we saw before. So remember this, right? This is for rich 27 countries, right? And then you look at the the shareholders that ultimately control more than 10% of the controlling votes. And you see how the ownership is. So you can see that, as I said earlier or last week, that US-UK is sort of an exception because these are the two countries where more than 80% are widely held, right? So these are the only two countries. But as you see, as you saw from last week, family, right, owns quite a bit. And here we're talking about state capitalism, so I have just, put this state in this, in the box. So, like in the top part of this panel, you can see like, Norway, Singapore, Spain, right? So they have like 45%, right, of the ownership. And if you go to the bottom panel, then you can see like 70%, like Austria is 70%, right? And like Italy is 50%. Yeah. So as you can see from this table, it's not, these are mostly, I think all of these are market economies. So therefore, even in these market economies, you can see this many state-owned or state-controlled companies, okay? So that's why you might think, oh, state-owned companies are for, former socialist countries, but former or currently socialist countries, but that's not true, right? So there are quite a few state-owned companies. Okay. So this is just an explanation of the slides. The page. Okay. And then here, this week, since this is, Asian capital markets, I'll mainly focus on China in this course. And there are, other countries like Vietnam, right, former socialist country, and then there are other countries in Asia, but we'll focus on basically on China for these 2 weeks. Okay, and well, first of all, because it's the largest, right, in Asia, and also the influence is very large. So that's why I mostly focus on China, and many interesting research has been done in the past, well, almost 20 years. Yeah, so that's why, and also in China, the data, right, that we can use for research is quite abundant. Yeah, used to be very difficult. You need some, you need to know someone in the government and have some guanxi, right, to use the data. But these days, the data is available, from various sources. So that's why there has been a lot of good studies in China. So that's why it's easy to, find interesting research. Okay, so therefore we'll focus on China. And then the first question is this, right? So why are there, this is a very basic question, why are there state-owned enterprise or SOEs? Yeah. So if you look at socialist economies, then state ownership is the norm, right? It's the norm in principle, right? And what the government does is, well, the government owns everything, and then government plans, right, and then allocates the resources by government's decision. You can say from the policy, right? So most of the things that has been used is called rationing, right? Rationing, right? So it basically says this amount is yours, this amount is yours, and this year this region will receive this amount of food or something like this, right? So that's rationing. So it's not using the so-called price mechanism, okay? So that's basically the principle, right? So on the other hand, market economies with private ownership is a norm, and allocation is done by price mechanism, right? So it's invisible hand. So if there's more demand than supply, then the price will go up, right? If there's more demand than supply, the price will go up. If the price goes up, then the companies will send the goods to that area or to that place so that they can, profit, right? So therefore, the price mechanism basically decides where the resources should be. So that's based on, demand and supply, right? So that's basically how this resource allocation works, right, in market economies. So basically it's a price mechanism. On the other hand, socialist economies, in principle, is rationing, okay, or you can say planning, okay. So, but we see that we've seen that even in market economies, you see a lot of state-owned companies. Okay, so why is this? So if you had taken microeconomics, okay, then you might have learned all these things. Okay, so there are rooms for government to step in. Okay, because in certain situations the market mechanism doesn't work. It doesn't work very well, okay? So one of the things is, like public goods. And public goods, for example, is like a park, right? Public park, right? Park. Or you can say like schools, right? Somewhat like a public good. Because you cannot price the usage, because you pay the price for the usage, right, or consumption. But if you go to a park, right, everyone can use it, right? So you cannot really charge them every time. Of course, there are parks that have entrance fees, but like if it's just, like parks in Canberra, you can just go there and walk around and enjoy. Right? So sometimes this market mechanism doesn't work, okay? Because you need to price, you need to have, well, in microeconomics, okay, there is a, utility, right, of using that good. And then, based on the marginal utility and the market mechanism, there will be a price, right? So, so therefore, but that's based on so-called private goods. But if it's a public good, like a park, then the market mechanism doesn't work that well. So that's why the governments, right, provide these, public goods like parks, or sometimes you can say public schools, or sometimes like hospitals, right? So these are the things that where market mechanism doesn't necessarily work, okay? Okay, so then there are other cases. The other example where market mechanism doesn't work is so-called natural monopolies. So natural monopoly is when the fixed cost is very high to build, let's say, railroad, right? Railroad is a very good example. Also, like telecommunication is another thing because you need a huge investment, right? So, so that's why if you let, let's say a private company to do this, then there will be only one company. And then the other thing is, because it takes so much, the fixed cost is very high. So therefore, to make profit, right, the average cost, at least the average cost, the price and if you know the relation between the cost and the average cost and the price, then the price has to be higher, right, than the average cost. But if the fixed cost is very high, you cannot lower the average cost too much, okay? So that's why this, like a government, right, will have these state-owned utility companies, right, like gas, electric, railways, and also telecommunications, sometimes airlines, right, are often state-owned, yeah, because the fixed cost is very high. Okay, so that's why even in market economies, there is a good reason to have state-owned firms or government-run companies. Okay, so that's why you see even in market economies, right, like this, or you can see quite a lot of state-owned companies, or the state. These are, staying like in Spain, right, like 45%, right? So, okay, so that's the reason why we see state-owned companies even in market economies. Socialist economies are by principle, yeah, they are all state-owned, okay. Okay, but interesting things happening, say in China, is that a lot of this market mechanism, right, is introduced into the country, right, since early 1990s. So therefore, if you look at China now, it's like a combination, right, of socialist company, socialist country or socialist mechanism and market mechanism, right? So it's very mixed. So that has been true for most of the socialist countries. Okay. So as I said, there has been, or there still is a lot of state-owned companies in market economies. But there has been in the large privatization programs, especially in or after 1980s, okay? So One of the famous one is Margaret Thatcher. She was the prime minister, right, of UK in the 80s. Okay, so she is the one that really pushed the privatization of state-owned enterprise. Okay, because it used to be 10%, right, of the GDP. Okay, but when she was in the government, then it became almost zero. Okay, so UK had a lot of these state-owned companies, and one of them is this British Telecom. Okay, and what happened? Well, why did Thatcher privatize these? Because these state-owned companies were very inefficient, basically losing money. Right? The management was very bad, losing money, bad service. So if they are losing money, then who has to subsidize this? Exactly, taxpayers, right? Yeah. So the taxpayers will be unhappy, right? So therefore, as a taxpayer, they're also the customers, right, of these state-owned companies, and then they receive bad service, right? And the company is losing money, and then you have to pay from your tax. So that's why the Thatcher government decided to, privatize almost all of them. Yeah, so that was in the 80s, and then just across the strait, France also did this in the 80s and 90s. Okay, so there was a big push of privatization in the 80s. And in Asia, this happened quite a bit in Japan, again in the 80s. So this is again a telegraph telephone, right? So it's called NTT. So this was privatized, and this was a huge company. Yeah, so when they privatized, it became like more than $120 billion, okay? And then there was this national railway, Japan National Railway. Now it's privatized and split into different, regions. So it's now called, instead of having the national in the middle, it's called Japan Rail, right? So it's JR. So if you have been to Japan, you probably take the train instead of JR, right? But in old days, it was National Railway. It's a big, national state-owned company. And, I know from my own experience, yes, service at some point was very bad, yeah. And a lot of labor strikes, and the operation is disrupted. You have to go to work, but you cannot go to work because the workers are, asking for a pay raise, right? And all these kind of things. So that's why I guess people said that's enough, privatize, right? And then, so it has been privatized for close to 30 years. Okay, so that's what has happened in Asia, especially this in Japan. Yeah. So basically, in the 80s, there was a huge, a large number of companies, state-owned companies, being privatized. Okay. So why do they privatize, right? So as I said, the state-owned companies typically are poorly managed. So that's why they lose money, and then the taxpayers say basically, no more. So that's usually the trigger for privatization in many countries. But there are other reasons. Well, first, if the government owns the company, then by selling the company, they can raise money, right? So raise revenue. So that's could be one reason. And the second reason is to promote economic efficiency, which is like state-owned companies are usually well, tends to be poorly run. So that's why to stop the bleed, they privatize, right? And the third reason is more of the introduction of more market mechanism in the economy. So instead of government deciding what the price is of electricity, right, or price of gas, they will, basically make it more free. Means that introduce more, demand and supply, and the pricing becomes, more depending on the market mechanism. So that's why the government, some governments want to, sort of reduce the interference. So that's the third reason. And then the fourth reason is more like, well, this is more from a corporate governance, that if it's just a one, state having all the company, 100% ownership, then there could be problems, right? Like agency problems, right? So there's no monitoring, right? Basically, it's the corporate governance issue. But if you do have a wide share ownership from, different investors, then there could be more monitoring from the shareholders, right? So even though there could be a large, government shareholder, but still there is more market, right? Or you can see more monitoring from the other investors. So the management cannot do, something very stupid, right? So, so this is the fourth reason. So it's more from the governance side. And the fifth one is to introduce a competition, right? So if you let state-owned companies compete, right, in the market, then there could be more, firms in that industry. So there could, that could introduce more competition. Yeah. So the fifth reason, the fifth reason is related to, more, economic efficiency. The second reason and the fifth reason is sort of, I think these are related to each other. And also the last one, subject SOEs to market discipline. Yeah. So these reasons, not necessarily, all of them are independent with each other, like promoting economic efficiency, reduce government interference, introduce more competition, and then subject SOE to market discipline are sort of, it's more like in the same, similar reasons. Okay, so so these are the reasons that government privatize SOEs. Okay. So, so what's happening in China and India? Okay, and it's interesting that China and India started privatization, or you can say economic reform and liberalization program around the same time, which is in the early 90s. Okay, and so this is when in China this started in 1992. That's Deng Xiaoping, right? My pronunciation is not good, but you understand, right? Deng Xiaoping. You understand, right? Okay, yeah, okay. So he said that, black cat or white cat, as long as they do catch the mouse, it's fine. And so I think that's what he said. So then he introduced the market mechanism into the economy. And then I think the first thing started was for the agricultural area or the farming. Like before, I think the government used to buy all these agricultural products from farmers, right, at like a fixed price. But then the first liberalization was if the farmers produce more than what the government buys, then they can sell, right, the excess to the market, right? So in that way, they have incentive to, well, I mean, they have the incentive to make money, right? So that was, so I guess that also increased the production, yeah. So that was how it started, if my understanding is correct, and then gradually introduced like the special economic zone, right? And then I think that like Shenzhen is one of them, and then they started, sort of having these firms, more, privatized firms in this area. And then that's when Chinese state-owned enterprise started listing, right, in the stock market. So that's where the buying or investing in the state-owned companies were very popular. That's when the stock market started to expand in the 90s. Yeah. So, so that's what we have experienced or what we have seen, and especially these Chinese SOEs, the traditional ones, used to have this social welfare responsibilities. Like I hear that they had like hospitals, schools, right, in the company, right? So therefore, if you work for this certain company, that's like for life, right? You're taken care of by the company for life. Perhaps not now, no longer nowadays, but in old days, maybe your grandparents, I don't know, it was something like that. If you work for state-owned companies, then that's basically, your whole welfare is taken care of. So, so that's why taking care of the people or the workers, right? So that is still there. That has been there, or it still might be there. So, so that's why I think the SOEs, especially in China, has this dual role, right? Of course, you have to make money as a listed company, but then at the same time, you have some objectives, right? To keep the employment or to some extent take care of the welfare, right? So, so that's why this China's privatization has different aspects. So we'll talk about this in detail later. Okay, so India, right? Independence in 1947, and then when they had independence, India adopted or more like a policy from, they were very close to Russia, which is, a socialist country. So they created a lot of these state-owned companies. But again, they started this privatization program in 1991. Yeah. But in both cases, in China and India, both countries, I think that it looks like the trigger was that, the SOE's performance was not very good. Okay. Okay. So the basic idea, right, of privatization is that if you privatize firms, then you are exposed to the market mechanism, right? So therefore, you become more efficient, right? So you use your resources more efficiently, so you don't waste the money. So that's basically the reason. But there are, it's not just if you don't do a good job, then people may not buy your product, right? Then you cannot sell the product, and you cannot make money, so therefore you have to improve the product. And also, from the finance point of view, if the company is not producing, or if the company is not making money, stock price will go down, right? Yeah. If the stock price goes down, then the cost of financing goes up, so that's not good. So that's, again, a market mechanism, right? So in many ways, these market forces can discipline the firm. So that's why the idea of privatization is to expose the firm to, or the management to, the market forces. Okay. So, but that's the idea, right? Like the idea, but reality is this, okay? The reality is that most of the privatized SOEs, okay, for most of the privatized SOEs, the government still owns quite a bit, okay? So this, when privatization is conducted, typically they do this so-called share issue privatization, okay? So share issue means that they issue the shares, right? And then sell to the public, okay? So, there will be, new investors, right, or shareholders, which comes from the private sector. But most of the state-owned companies, even though it's listed and traded, the government still controls quite a bit. So that's why it's not 100% privatized. It is partially privatized. Okay? The ownership and control is still with the government. Okay? Not 100%, but partially. So this is a study which looked at privatization from 1977 to 1999 in 59 countries. They found that share issue privatization, right, 88.5%, the government does not sell the entire SOEs. So basically, the 100% privatization is only like 12% or less than 12%. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, this is a paper by Jones, Megginson, and Nash. And Netter, yeah. So this Professor Megginson is quite well known for this kind of privatization research. So he has written many papers in this field. Yeah. So this is from Journal of Financial Economics, and they basically look at all these countries, 59 countries, and then this is what they find. So people thought, oh, okay, privatization, okay, it's all privatized, right, 100%, but it's not. So that's why government might have major control, okay, still controlling the privatized SOEs. But yet they are listed on the stock market. So it's a mix, right? If the government still controls a large number of shares, but it's listed, so it is exposed to the market mechanism. Okay. So the question is, okay, is this good, right? Is this good or bad? Is it better to privatize or, partially privatize, or is it better to 100% privatize, or is it still okay to have this, partial privatization? So that becomes a big question, right? Okay, so to answer this question, there is a very good research paper from India. Yeah. So this Professor Gupta, she found, using the Indian privatization, she said that even if it's partially privatized, it's probably better than 100% state-owned. So she basically says that, yes, market mechanism, at least, if the company is partially privatized and listed on the stock market, there is market discipline. So the performance of the firm is better than before. So that's what she finds. Yeah. So that's why she says, well, the stock market can play in monitoring and rewarding managerial performance even when the government remains the controlling owner. Okay? And she basically used the Indian state-owned enterprise, and that basically is partially privatized, and then compared before and after. So she has the data before privatization and then after privatization, and then compared these profitability, productivity, and investment, and then she finds that all these variables improve. Okay. Yeah. So this is the main table from her paper. So you can see, right? This is in the the second column, average before privatization. So these are the average of like profitability, sales, profit, productivity, average product, returns to labor, financing, and investment, right? So, so she looked at all these variables before privatization and after privatization, and then compare both of them. Okay? So if you see, like for sales, right, it's 5.815, and after, that's before, and after is 7.006. The difference is, okay, the difference between this 5.8 and 7.0 is the third column, but the third column is just showing the T statistics. Okay, this is the T statistics. It's not the difference. Yeah. So basically, it means that these two means, before and after, are the difference, are the means, difference in means statistically different. Right? Basically testing whether the difference is zero or not. Okay? If it's significantly different from zero, yeah, at certain statistical significance levels, then these are given the stars. So if you have a 3-star, if you look at the bottom of this table, 3-star is at the 1% level, right? It's significant at the 1% level. Okay? So it's very significant, right? 2-star would be like a 5%, 10, and if it's 1-star, that's 1%, 10%. So if there's no star, that means the difference is not significant, okay? Statistically significant. So, but if you look at this, you can see that for most of the variables, like sales, profit, right, productivity, which is average product, well, this is only 10%. Returns to labor is not different. Labor productivity is different, which means it has improved after privatization. And financing, where this is government loan over total borrowing, which means that how much you borrow from the government or the government banks. So that has substantially become less, right, after privatization. Yeah. So if you tend to borrow from government banks, if the SOE tend to borrow from government banks, the mechanism, you can say the disciplining mechanism can be weak, right? If it's a private bank, then they have to make money, right? So therefore, they will make sure that the borrower, pays back the loan, right? But if it's a government bank, then they might have some other objectives, right, to help the state-owned companies. So therefore, the government loan has gone down quite a bit after privatization, right? So which is probably a good sign. And also the investment, asset R&D investment, R&D intensity, capital expenditure over sales, except for the last one, yes, they have all increased, right? So this is showing, so that's why the conclusion of this paper is that even though the government owns large part of these privatized companies, which is partially privatized, the performance improves quite a bit. So that's why she said that, the stock market can play in monitoring and rewarding managerial performance. Okay? So that's an example from India. Okay. So, which is, sounds good, but why do governments still control the firm? You see, that is the big question, okay? Of course, it used to be state-owned, so they want to continue, right, implementing a similar policy, okay? So that could be the reason. But to understand why the government has such an objective, or why they do this, you should please read this Schleifer and Vishny's paper. Not paper, this is the first chapter in their book called Grabbing Hand. So this book is a collection of papers that Schleifer and Vishny wrote. Schleifer and Vishny is that the two authors from the LLSV paper, right? The SV, right? So they wrote this. They have this collection of papers in a book, but the first chapter they wrote for the book. So that's why it's a very good introduction. So that's why I have included this as a required readings for this course. So it's non-technical, it's just readings, okay? But please read this. It's a very good chapter to read, and it's easy to read. Yeah. Okay? You can find a copy on Watto, okay? So they use a very catchy name, okay? So as I said, the title of the book is Grabbing Hand, okay? So where is this coming from? Well, first, we know that Adam Smith, right, used this word invisible hand, right, for market mechanism, right? So the demand and supply and the price, right, fluctuates according to the demand and supply, and then according to this, price, the resources are allocated. Right? So that's basically market mechanism. So you don't need like a government to interfere. So basically, all the private enterprise can participate in, buying and selling goods, and then the price will be determined, and that's when you have the best allocation. Okay? So that's why it was called invisible hand. Right? But as I mentioned earlier about the role of government in the market economy, there is a case where the market mechanism doesn't work, right? It doesn't work for certain cases, which is like public goods and also, like natural monopolies. So these are the cases where the market mechanism or a pure private sector doesn't work. Because that's why there is a role for the government, right? But in that case, government is helping. So you can call this helping hands. I think that's what Schleifer Vishny mentioned, okay? It's a helping hand. So if there's a failure in the market mechanism, the government can step in and give a helping hand. But this is what Schleifer-Vishny said. But the government, especially like if you look at the example in China before, right, in SOEs, so the government had, right, social responsibility, like, social stability or employment, right, maintain employment. So that's basically you can say political objectives, okay? So these objectives, the government has to achieve. So they will do this using a visible hand, right? So the government is there, so they provide this like social stability, employment, all these things through the state-owned companies. So, so that's a visible hand, okay? Even in market economies, there is visible hand, right? So the government interferes or intervenes and then provide social welfare and all these things, right? So that's a visible hand, right? But the thing is, Schleifer and Vishny says, well, this hand can be a grabbing hand, okay? Grabbing hand. So that's where this word grabbing hand is coming from, because of the title of the book is Grabbing Hand. And grabbing hand means the government, right, will can perhaps expropriate resources from their people. Okay? So that's what they say. So that's why the state-owned enterprise can be a grabbing hand. That's they're suggesting, or that's what they say. Okay. And this is probably coming from like Schleifer's experience. He's basically Russian. So what happened in Russia, when there was this, the collapse of the Soviet Union, then there was this, a lot of privatization, right? And then he probably saw those privatized companies, but yet the government is still holding, controlling, okay? And then in those days, they were very rich people, but these people benefit, right, from these former state-owned companies when they privatized, okay? So then Mr. Putin came, right, and then they did the reverse. He basically nationalized those companies, okay? But I guess what Schleifer and Vishny is mentioning is, what happened like in Russia after the, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, so that's why now we have, right, many hands, right? Well, invisible hand, helping hand, right? Visible hand, but visible hand can be helping, but also can be grabbing. So it's a catchy name. Okay. All right. So, so the actual objectives of the state control firm, or the state control of firms, is that, for example, in China, right? As I said, there was like a social responsibility, okay? So that's why, as I said, social stability and maintaining employment, okay? So that's probably one of the reasons, okay? For many countries, other countries, also including China, is that the government has this strategic industries. Okay, so they have it can be part of the economic planning, okay, that they would like to foster certain industries for growth, okay. So a famous one in Japan is in the 1950s and 70s when, the economy was growing very fast. This ministry called Ministry of Trade and Industry, it used to be called MITI, yeah. And this was a very powerful ministry. They oversaw all of these different industries. And then they sort of wrote up, oh, this industry should go this way, right? So it's not necessarily, it's not private, it's a private companies. In the industry there are private companies, but the government, right? The government basically has huge influence on what the industry should be doing, yeah. So when they decide on like where a steel industry should do, and then they will ask the banks to provide financing, right, with very low interest rates. Okay, so those were the things that were happening in Japan in the 50s and 70s. So it's not necessary. You cannot say this is a market mechanism. It's more like a planned economy. So that's where the ministry had a huge influence. And this is called industrial policy. And this industrial policy has been done, in Korea as well, in China, I think now it's there. And so in many countries, it's still there, yeah. So, so the government has, or the state has some objective, right? But if this is done through a private company, which is a listed company with shareholders, then this state objective may not be the same, right, as maximizing shareholder wealth. So therefore, there could be a conflict between the shareholders' profit or the shareholders' value and the government's objective. Yeah. So that's where this conflict can occur. So this is, it's in a sense, it's like an agency problem, right? But here is when we talk about agency problem in American textbooks, it's the agency problem between shareholders, which is dispersed, and the managers, right? But here we are talking about the shareholders. Well, shareholders, not the government shareholders, but the government control and the rest of the shareholders. Okay, so so that's where the conflict might occur. Okay, so the next question is, how does government control these partially privatized firms? Okay, right. Well, they can control by holding a majority, right? So like in China, I think still like more than 40% is owned by the government, okay? And the second part is the so-called special voting rights. I have mentioned this earlier, that it's not one share, one vote. So one share, if it's a government, can have a veto power, which means it's called super shares. Okay, so it can veto anything. Okay. The third one is you send the managers, right? The government sends the managers to the company. So basically, the managers are politically connected, right, to the government. Yeah. So that's how they control. Yeah. Okay, so this is an example of Chinese listed firms. Okay, and this shows the government ownership and control. Okay, so this is from like a World Bank research. And first column, right? This is a shareholder type: state, legal person, employee, tradable shares, and total, right? So this is all 100%. But you can see this is the ownership. This is the ownership. And the state owns 24, right? Legal person 44. Legal person is not a person, right? It's an institution. Yeah, it's like you can say it's a company, but this legal person can be controlled by the government, right? So therefore, the legal person is often, or I think in most cases, is a state, part of the state. Okay. And then employees and tradable shares, because the tradable shares are basically, widely held by investors. But as you can see, the control, which are the boards, they count the number of board seats. The state has 21, legal person 48, right? But if you look at tradable shares, like 4, right? So therefore, you can see that there's a discrepancy between ownership and control, right? If you take the average, right? Ownership is 100% for these, but you can see that, especially for the tradable shares, this board seat is only 4, right? So it means that for private investors, they only hold 4 seats, okay, on the board, okay? Board is, the corporate board. So you can see that state, right, and legal person holds most of them. But what's important is here, right? You can say the private investors only has 4 board seats. Okay. So there you can see the discrepancy, between ownership and control. This is not using the ultimate ownership, right? This is not using the cash flow and voting rights ratio. This is comparing the ownership and the board seats, okay? So who sits on the board? Yeah. So for Chinese firms, listed firms, the ownership, rights are typically exercised by a designated state when they are the state or the government, right? And this can be central as well as local, which means that for the central, it's state-owned asset supervision and administration commission. It's called SAC. So they oversee large state-owned enterprise groups. Okay. At the local level, there is a similar structure where this local SAC oversee non-financial SOEs, because banks typically are overseen by the Ministry of Finance or a local finance bureau. So this is at the bottom of the slide, right? So so that's why this local government and the central government has this, oversight, okay? Okay. And then this is comparing to China. This is Singapore. Singapore looks like this, okay? Singapore, as we saw in the table of the ownership, right? The Singapore has a fairly large state ownership, right? I think it was like 40%, right? So how do they control? Well, this is quite different from China, okay? So as I might have said this earlier, but the government investment company called Temasek. So this is one of them. There are other government investment companies. So Temasek owns the listed companies, okay? And Temasek itself is a national holding company, which is 100% owned by the government, which is Ministry of Finance, okay? And then Temasek holds the companies, right, the listed companies. Here I say SOEs. Yeah. So, so Temasek, what they do is they have a substantial authority in affecting or influencing the board appointments. Okay, so and they make sure that their companies that they hold have high quality boards. So what they do is when they appoint a board, the Temasek has a say in who to appoint. Okay, so you can see that like in Singapore, like again, like a telecom company, right? Like a Singtel. Singtel is a Singapore telecom, right? It used to be state-owned. It's privatized, but large part is held by this Temasek. And people call this sovereign wealth funds. Sovereign wealth funds. Okay, and we'll talk about sovereign wealth funds next week. But Temasek is basically, it's like a holding company. So people say these are investment companies. But the fact is they do have a say, right, in appointing the board members. Okay? But again, it's true that even, let's say, big institutional investors like mutual funds, right, they can hold a large part of a private company, and they could have some influence on like the board appointments. Yeah. So it's not, this function is not necessarily unique to Temasek, okay? Institutional investors, right? They can have a similar influence. But for Singapore, it's quite it's clear, and I think this is probably quite influential. Okay, but the Ministry of Finance doesn't directly influence. It's always through Temasek. Okay, or there's another sovereign wealth fund called Government Investment Corporation, GIC. Yeah, so they also do the similar thing. But Ministry of Finance basically appoints the chairman and members of the Temasek's board. Okay, so that's how the government influences. Okay, yeah. So this is how the government influence or control private firms, listed firms, or you can say, well, I think for Singapore they don't call state-owned enterprise anymore, but like Singtel and all these companies. Okay, so this is an example for Singapore. Yeah, so it's quite different from how it's done in China, right? So China seems like it's more direct, right? Okay. So I have uploaded this on Watto, this World Bank study. And the title is Visible Hand. Okay, so this I already uploaded on the Watto, so you can take a look. It's very easy to read a survey. Okay, so so this is talking about China's ownership, and especially those legal person, right? A legal person. So this is it's a bit old. I don't know if it's still there. Called Zongjing Non-Ferrous Metal Limited. So the major shareholder of this metal company is National Non-Ferrous Metal Bureau. So it's owned by the government directly, okay? So that's the major shareholder, right? So in this case, it's directly owned by the state, okay? And then the legal person, right, as I said, I think is mostly government controlled or government owned. So it's not necessarily a bureau of a government, but the legal person itself, right, is owned by the government. Yeah. So, so that's why I said if you see a legal person, then that is probably is a government. Okay. Okay. So that's the case for China. So this is just one example. So how do Chinese SOEs, how were they privatized? Okay. So this is a very good paper that showed the process, how Chinese SOEs were privatized. So this is a paper written by Deng, Gan, and He. It's called Political Constraints, Organizational Forms, and Privatization Performance, Evidence from China. And this shows an example of Harping Air Conditioning Company. Okay, I don't know if you have heard of it. Have you? No? Okay. So the government, right, used to own 100% of this Harping Air Conditioning Company, right? And in this company, since this is the traditional state-owned firm, it has this so-called the asset that produces air conditioning, right? So this is what they're doing. This is the business. But the thing is, they have this non-productive asset, which is, says, transportation, medical clinic, right? And also they still take care of the retired workers, okay? So there are, you can say that this left-hand part is the productive asset, and the right-hand part is a non-productive asset, right? So what the government did is, okay, spin off this productive asset, right, which is producing air conditioning, and did this IPO, right, initial public offering. So they basically listed, or you can say floated, this productive asset and made it as Harping Air Conditioning Company Limited. Yeah. So this is listed, right? And then, as a result, because they issue new shares, right? So as a result, 41% comes from the public market and employees, right? And the rest, 59%, still the government owns, okay? And then what happens to this non-productive part? Well, it is called Harping Air Conditioning Industrial Company. The name is very similar, but this is not listed. So they took this non-productive asset and workers and retired workers, right? And then this is 100% owned, okay? So this is one of the ways the government privatized this state-owned company, SOE. Okay. And this is supposed to be a good example, okay? Because here, right, is the listed company has a fairly clear structure, although the government still owns close to 60%, right? It's the government direct ownership, right? And then you have this public ownership, okay? So according to this paper, but this is called complete restructuring, okay? Check the time, yeah. Okay, now, now this is a different case. This is called Sichuan Chemical Group. So here, right? So this is the original SOE, which has productive assets and non-productive assets, okay? Now, in this privatization, what they did was they created this sd1 chemical group, which is the parent company, which holds non-productive assets. Okay? And then the government owns 100% of the sd1 chemical group, which is the parent company. Okay? And what did they do with the productive assets? Well, they did the IPO, right? IPO. So they listed this company, and it's called sd1 Chemical Company Limited. Okay? But, and this listed company is owned 72% by this so-called parent company, which is sd1 Chemical Group. Okay? And because of the IPO, you issue new shares, and then 28% is held by the public. Okay? But this case is different from the previous Harpin air conditioning. The government control is not direct, right? So it goes through this non-productive firm, which is the parent company. So the it sounds like the medical clinic, kindergarten, and retired workers are controlling this listed company, right? But the thing is, the structure is not very clear in this case. Basically, the control is not clear. Why should this company that holds non-productive asset control 72%? Okay? So how is this going to work? Yeah. So so that's why this paper says, well, this is incomplete restructuring. So this, they say, is incomplete. Okay. Okay, let me see. Let me check the time. Let me see. Yeah, let me check. If I should stop here or not. Yeah, so, yeah, perhaps I should stop here. Yes, so we'll continue this on Thursday. No, Thursday? Yeah, Thursday. Yeah, yeah. So, so yeah, we'll go and compare how the performance and all these things for these different types of privatization. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. Any questions? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Basically, good ones and bad